Chapter 19 of the Boy Scouts in a Trapper's Camp by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Sparrer Saves the Skin. Without hesitancy, Pat followed the Indian. It was a queer sight, the Indian leading with his hands bound behind him, and Pat with his rifle across the hollow of one arm stalking grimly behind him. They were soon lost to view, and the others settled down to wait and speculate. It was almost 3/4 of an hour later that they reappeared, and it was seen at once that Pat carried a black object swinging from one hand. As by one impulse, the three boys rushed forward to meet them. In their haste, they quite forgot that they were on snowshoes, with the result that Sparrer took an inglorious header, in the course of which he upset Walter, and the latter, landing on the tail of one of Hal's shoes, sent him sprawling. Alec roared, and even Big Pierre permitted himself to grin. By the time all three had regained their feet, Pat and the Indian had come up. "Here you are, son. See if you can take better care of him this time," said Pat as he flung the fox at Sparrer's feet. With a cry of joy, Sparrer seized the fox and held him up for the admiring gaze of his comrades. The animal had not been skinned, for which Pat and Alec were sincerely thankful. This important matter and the stretching of the skin they preferred to attend to themselves, especially after seeing the careless way in which some of the furs found in the cabin had been handled. "Where did you find him?" asked Hal as he ran his fingers through the luxuriant fur. "In a hollow tree, just as Pierre guessed," replied Pat. "The Injun wouldn't answer any questions, but it is clear enough that he didn't have time to skin the beast last night, and hid it there on his way to camp, intending to get it the first chance he had when Pierre wasn't around. He took good care of it, and it is in perfect condition. That was some shot of yours, son." Sparrer flushed with pleasure. "'Twasn't nothing," he mumbled. "Anybody could have done it." By this time they had rejoined Alec and Pierre. The latter's eyes glittered as he ran them appraisingly over the beautiful black form of the fox, then darted a malevolent gaze in the direction of his partner. "What will that skin bring, Alec?" asked Pat. The trapper was studying the fox with the critical stare of the expert. "I dinna ken, Pat," he replied slowly. "'Tis a big beastie, and by all odds the finest fur I ever put my eyes on. It'll bring $1,500 anyway, and maybe $2,000. I never thought to lay my eyes on the likes of it." He turned and looked at Sparrer with the expression of almost awe. "Tell me, laddie, what is the charm you carry?" said he. Sparrer laughed. "I don't even have a rabbit's foot," he confessed. "Sure, and it was just the luck of the Irish." "Right, me son. Hooray for the Irish!" cried Pat. Then, with an abrupt change, he once more became the leader. "Alec, go through the clothes of our misguided friends and see that they have no cartridges in their pockets." This Alec did, despite the protests of Big Pierre. When he was sure that he had secured all of these, thus rendering the guns useless, he set both prisoners free, at Pat's order, and they were commanded to pack up their stuff and get ready to hit the trail. This they did sullenly enough, for they felt that they were under guard, as indeed they were. Their packs were soon ready, for besides their blankets, a few cooking utensils, and grub, they had little enough. The latter included part of the ill-gotten deer meat. When they were about ready to start, Big Pierre made one last plea for cartridges, at least for himself. But Pat was obdurate, and told them that they were lucky to be allowed to take their guns. When all was ready for the trail, their knives were returned to them, and the Frenchman's axe was given him. The Indian's axe Pat retained. "You may like it as a bit of a souvenir of the lump in your head," he murmured in an aside to Sparrer, though his real reason was that he feared what might happen should the two outlaws be equally armed when it came to the quarrel which he felt sure was brewing between them. They were given a final warning to get wholly out of the country and never show their faces there again on pain of having the charges of poaching and theft brought against them. The big Frenchman was manifestly glad enough to get off so lightly, but there was an ugly gleam in the black eyes of his companion. Sparrer had laid the fox on the snow and drawn a few steps away from it, the better to watch proceedings. As the outlaws started to hit the trail to the north, the redskin in the lead, the latter suddenly sprang toward the fox, at the same instant snatching his knife from his belt. Sudden as was his move, Sparrer was too quick for him. He thrust forward a foot that tripped the Indian and sent him sprawling, Sparrow also being upset. Before the Indian could regain his feet, Big Pierre was on him, sending his big fist crashing full into the swarthy face. Then, wrenching the knife from his grasp, Pierre flung it far into the brush and once more raised his fist. By this time Pat and Alec had joined the melee and were dragging the infuriated Frenchman from his victim. All the time Pierre poured out a stream of invective which only the Indian and Alec could understand. The latter explained later that he was charging his companion with trying to put them both in prison after they had been fortunate enough to win their freedom, believing, and rightly, that if the Indian had succeeded in slashing the skin as he had intended, they would have been held and turned over to the proper authorities. "That puts me even with him," shrilled Sparrow triumphantly as he mounted guard over the fox. And the Indian with the bruised and battered face regained his feet and once more hit the trail, Big Pierre at his heels heaping abuse upon him. As he disappeared in the brush, Pat dropped the butt of his rifle to the snow. "That's the end of that precious pair, so far as we are concerned," said he with a sigh of relief. "Pierre is wise enough to know that this isn't a healthy country for them, and they won't bother us any more. He's got the Indian where the hair is short now, for the latter hasn't even got a knife, and I guess it's just as well. Now we'll finish our job here and get back to camp. You fellows rustle up some birch bark and dry wood and heap it up inside the cabin." "What for?" demanded Hal, looking blank. "To fumigate after the presence of a skunk," retorted Pat whimsically. By means of the belt axes of the boys, supplemented by the Indian's axe in the hands of Alec, a pile of inflammable stuff was soon collected and heaped up inside the cabin. Then Pat touched a match to the pile, and soon the whole interior was a roaring furnace. The bark roof quickly burned through and fell with a great hissing of the snow which it carried down with it, sending the sparks and embers skyward in a golden cloud. Satisfied that the destruction of the camp would be sufficient to render it uninhabitable, Pat ordered all hands to make ready for the return to their own camp, and they were soon on the trail. The fire was left to burn itself out, as no harm could come from it, owing to the snow-covered surroundings. Hal still puzzled over the burning of the cabin. "I should think you would have wanted to keep it, Pat," he ventured at length. "It might have come in handy some time." "'Twas too handy altogether as it was," retorted Pat. "When you've dug a fox out, fill up his den." And with this cryptic reply Hal was forced to be content. Sparrow, having no rifle, insisted on carrying the fox, an honor granted him with one accord. Very different was their entrance into Smuggler's Hollow from their departure in the small hours of that same day, and there was much jesting and hilarity, for their buoyant spirits had rebounded wonderfully now that the load of anxiety and the dread had been lifted. Pat and Alec each carried a bundle of furs sufficient in themselves to raise their spirits to a high plane, for these, added to those they already had, assured the financial success of their partnership. As they came in sight of their cabin, Upton called attention to a thin vapor of smoke rising from the chimney. "Somebody's there, sure as I'm alive and kicking," exclaimed Pat. "Now I wonder who's paying us a visit this time." As if in answer, the door opened and a big burly form stepped forth. "Jim! Oh, you Jim!" yelled Upton delightedly. The big guide and lumber boss, for it was he, turned in their direction, his weather-tanned face lighting with real pleasure. Then, as they drew nearer, a comical look of wonder and perplexity crossed it. He stepped back to the door and apparently spoke to someone inside, for a second later another strapping big man stepped out. "Hello!" exclaimed Pat. "That's Bill Marshman, the game warden and deputy sheriff who was looking for Alec last fall and scared away the bear the day we left Plimpton to take care of the camp. It's lucky for those two chaps back there," nodding in the direction from which they had come. "The Bill didn't get here a day sooner. They wouldn't have got off so easy." By this time the party had approached within easy talking distance of the men at the cabin, who were staring at them in dumb amazement. Pat chuckled. "Hello, Jim. Hello, Bill," he called. "Mighty glad to see you. Sorry you didn't get here sooner as to join our little expedition." "Say," drawled the warden, "is this a war party returning from a raid?" "You've guessed it," declared Pat, dropping his load and shaking hands warmly with the two men. In the absence of the constituted authority," he poked his fist into the ribs of the warden by way of emphasizing the point, "we have been upholding the majesty of the law and the rights of free-born American citizens, and yez have just missed putting the bracelets on as ugly a pair of villains as ever stole furs of honest men." A light broke over the sheriff's face. "Big Pierre and his Injun partner," he exclaimed. "I was tipped off that they were somewhere about here, and that's what brought me in. Where are they now?" "Hitting the trail for parts unknown," replied Pat. "I'll tell you all about it later. Meanwhile, here are some friends of mine you ought to know and keep an eye on, Bill. They'll bear watching." He then introduced the three boys. Spar still clung to his prize, and as he came forward to shake hands, Jim and the warden sensed for the first time what it was he was carrying. "By gum!" exclaimed Jim. "I believe that's the very fellow I was telling you about, Bill. Saw him the last time I was over here. Did you trap him, Pat, or is he part of the spoils of war?" "Wrong both ways, Jim," replied Pat. "He was the cause of this little expedition. Come on, and while we're rustling up some grub, we'll tell you the yarn." Jim and the warden listened with growing interest and appreciation while Pat unfolded the story. When it ended, the warden gravely arose and walked over to Spar. "Shake hands over again, son," said he, to the boy's great confusion. "If I had had to sit still and watch a fortune trot around the way you did, I sure would have been so plumb shaky that I have missed the shot when the time came. What are you going to do with him now that you've got him?" Thus did the warden bring to a head a question that had been troubling the boy ever since the fox was recovered. "He ain't mine," he gulped. "I lost him, and wouldn't never seen him again if it hadn't been for them." He nodded in the direction of Pat and Alec. "He's theirs, and they ain't no use talking about it." Spar set his lips firmly. In an instant Pat and Alec were on their feet, protesting that such talk was foolishness, and that the prize belonged to Spar and no one else. But the boy shook his head stubbornly. "Seems to me," drawled the warden when he could make himself heard, "that this here is a case for a disinterested party to decide. Now, if you was to ask me, I should say that an even split, 50-50, is the fair thing. This here young tenderfoot comes up here with horseshoes or rabbit's feet or some other luck charms hung all over him and without no help from anyone. Bags of fortune which he finds running around loose. Right up to that point it's his'n, and nobody else ain't got no claim on it. Then he loses it, and ain't got no more chance of getting it back himself than a bull moose has of growing a long tail. Up steps Pat and Alec, and friendly like does for him what he can't do for himself, and gets the prize back. Now, it seems to me that half ought to go to this here young feller for getting it in the first place, and half to the other two for getting it back after it was lost. What do you say, Jim?" "It's the only fair thing," declared Jim judiciously. "There's enough in it to give 'em all a comfortable bit." A warm discussion followed in which Hal and Upton sided with the warden and Jim, and it ended only when Spar at last agreed to a three-way split. From this stand no amount of argument could move him. He would take a third share if Pat and Alec would each take a third. Otherwise he wouldn't take any, and so it was finally agreed. The skinning and stretching of the hide was left to Alec, who was a past master in the art. While he was thus engaged, the warden mysteriously beckoned Pat to one side. "Pat, whose are these?" he asked gravely, drawing a bunch of traps from under a bunk. Pat reached for them and examined them curiously. "Mine. That is, mine and Alec's. Those are our marks," he replied, pointing to certain file marks on them. "Where did you get them?" he added wonderingly. "Where I got this fellow," replied the warden, reaching under the bunk and drawing out the body of a beaver. "I know you better than to think you had a hand in this, Pat," he continued, but he hesitated and then continued hurriedly. "I thought perhaps your partner has been doing a little poaching unbeknown to you. You know he didn't have the best name ever when he first came into these parts." A great light broke over Pat's face. "Alec don't know nothing more about this than I do," he declared. "There ain't a straighter man in the woods than Alec is now, and you just want to make up your mind about that right now, Bill. That's the work of that thieving Injun. You mind what I told you about Spar's finding those traps in the beaver pond? Well, it's plain as the nose on your face. That Injun lifted some of our traps and set them there. He knew that if you came snooping round and found 'em, the marks on 'em would point to us. Those skunks didn't have any traps anyway. Thinking about that fox, I'd clean forgotten about the beaver. Poor little chap." Pat stroked the body of the beaver. Alec was now called in, and his look of blank astonishment when he saw the traps and the dead animal was all that was needed to convince the warden that Pat was right in his surmise. That evening Jim explained his visit by stating that he had all along planned to get over to the hollow before the boys left. When the warden dropped into his camp early that morning and stated his intention of going into the hollow, Jim decided that he would accompany him. "How are you boys getting back?" he asked. "Same way we came in, I suppose," replied Upton. "What's the matter with putting a day with me and seeing how logging cap is run? Then I'll send you out to the railroad on a big lumber wagon," suggested the big lumber boss. The idea appealed to the boys, and it was finally agreed that they would accompany him to his camp the next day. It would give them a new experience for which they were eager, and at the same time eliminate the long hike back to Lower Chain. So, not without sincere regret, it must be admitted, they got their duffel together preparatory to an early start the next morning for the 15-mile hike to Jim's headquarters. They turned in early, for now that the excitement was over, they felt the reaction from the long strain they had been under and the loss of sleep the night before. Jim and the warden bunked on the floor, and the cabin of the Smuggler's Hollow was soon wrapped in silence save for the gentle breathing of the sleepers. So ended a red-letter day for at least 3 of the occupants. End of chapter 19.